In my decades of sitting on the bench, I have heard every conceivable lie, every pathetic excuse, and every fabricated piece of nonsense a human being can invent. People walk into my courtroom thinking they are the smartest ones in the room. They think they can pull the wool over my eyes. They look at me, a woman with a lace collar and a gavel, and they think they can play games. They find out very quickly how wrong they are. I eat liars for breakfast, and I do not tolerate fools. If you believe that the truth always comes to the light, leave a comment below. Because what the woman standing before me brought into my courtroom on this particular morning was about to detonate a bomb that would shatter the walls of deception. I looked down at my docket, a financial dispute over missing estate funds. On paper, it looked like a run-of-the-mill family squabble over a late husband's business account. But let me tell you something, my friends. Paperwork only tells you the what. The people standing before me tell you the why. If you do not pay attention to the body language, to the shifting eyes, to the nervous sweat, you miss the entire truth. The bailiff called the case. Stepping up to the plaintiff's podium was Eleanor Vance, a widow of just 6 months. She was dressed in a faded black dress that hung loosely on her frame, carrying the exhausted look of someone fighting a relentless war in the dark. Her hands were trembling, but her grip on a small, battered leather handbag was absolutely white-knuckled. She guarded it against her chest, as if it held the very breath in her lungs. She looked like a woman who had been fundamentally broken by betrayal. At the other podium stood Richard, her late husband's younger brother and former business partner. He wore an expensive tailored suit, a heavy gold watch flashing under the lights, and a smug little smirk. I absolutely despise that smirk. It is the pure arrogance of someone who thinks they are above decency. In my room, that is a fatal mistake. I adjusted my glasses. Mrs. Vance, you are suing your brother-in-law for $10,000, claiming he drained your late husband's account right after his funeral. Eleanor nodded, her voice a whisper. Yes, Your Honor. Speak up, madam. Tears don't work on me, I told her deliberately. I didn't say it to be cruel. I said it because predators like Richard feed on weakness. I needed her to find her spine, because what she had hidden in that battered handbag was about to stop my courtroom cold. Mr. Vance, I said, turning my attention to the man in the tailored suit, who was practically vibrating with self-importance. Your sister-in-law claims that less than 48 hours after your brother's funeral, you emptied the joint operating account of exactly $10,000. You left her with past due mortgage notices and unpaid medical bills. Explain yourself, and do it quickly. Richard leaned into the microphone, flashing a smile entirely too polished for a family court dispute over a dead brother's money. Your Honor, I sympathize with Eleanor's grief. I truly do. Losing Arthur has been devastating for all of us. He placed a manicured hand over his heart, a theatrical gesture that immediately set my teeth on edge. But a business is a business. That account was strictly for our shared contracting firm. Arthur had outstanding debts to the company. As the surviving managing partner, I had a fiduciary duty to secure those funds to keep the business afloat. It wasn't personal. It was protocol. He slid a neat stack of ledger printouts and banking agreements across the table to my bailiff, who handed them up to the bench. On paper, it was a masterpiece of corporate justification. The ledgers showed transfers, operational costs, and supposed liabilities. He had documentation for everything. That is the thing about arrogant swindlers. They always think a mountain of fabricated paperwork will blind the court to the underlying theft. They think judges cannot read between the lines. So, you are telling me, I said, leaning forward and lowering my voice to that dangerous octave that usually makes smart people stop talking, that the very second your brother was put into the ground, your immediate fiduciary duty was to leave his grieving widow completely penniless? Is that the narrative you are going with today? I was protecting his legacy, Your Honor, Richard replied, his voice dripping with faux sincerity. Arthur would have wanted the business to survive. I looked over at Eleanor. She had not interrupted. She had not yelled. She had not caused a scene. She just stood there, her knuckles white as she clutched that old leather handbag. In my experience, people who are lying usually shout to be heard. People who are holding the absolute truth are often terrifyingly quiet. I knew right then that Richard's pristine stack of corporate ledgers was nothing but expensive kindling. Mrs. Vance, I said, shifting my gaze back to the widow. He says the money belonged strictly to the business. What do you say? Eleanor took a deep, shuddering breath. She slowly unclasped the brass latch of her handbag. I say he is a liar, Your Honor. And Arthur knew it too. The entire courtroom went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Eleanor reached into that worn-out leather handbag, the one she had been guarding like her own life depended on it. Her trembling fingers pulled out a small, outdated digital voice recorder. It was scuffed at the edges, the kind of cheap device someone might use to dictate grocery lists. But in my years on the bench, I have seen the most ordinary, unassuming items hold the most explosive truths. Richard's smirk faltered. Just a fraction of a second, but I saw it. His eyes darted to the recorder, then back to Eleanor, and suddenly, the polished, grieving brother-in-law routine started to crack. "Your Honor," he interrupted, his voice pitching up a nervous octave. "This is highly irregular. We are here to discuss corporate ledgers, not whatever theatrical prop she brought to elicit sympathy. That device has not been entered into formal discovery." "Mr. Vance," I snapped, slamming my hand flat on the mahogany bench. "I did not ask for your legal expertise. You are not the judge here. I am. And in my courtroom, I determine what is relevant. If you interrupt me again, I will have the bailiff escort you out and rule against you by default. Do we understand each other?" He swallowed hard, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Yes, Your Honor." "Good." I turned my attention back to the widow. She was no longer shaking. The moment she held that recorder, a sudden wave of strength seemed to wash over her. It is a profound thing to witness the exact second a victim decides they are no longer going to be prey. "Mrs. Vance," I said, keeping my voice firm but lowering the volume, "tell me what you have in your hand. You claim your brother-in-law is a liar and that your late husband knew it. That is a very serious accusation to make in a court of law. You better have the evidence to back it up." Eleanor looked right at Richard, her eyes flashing with a grief so heavy it practically cast a shadow over the room. "2 days before my husband died, Your Honor, he knew his heart was failing. He also knew Richard had been making side deals, funneling our company money into personal offshore accounts. Arthur was too weak to get to the bank to gather the physical statements, but he was not too weak to speak." She held up the small black recorder, her grip steady now. "This is Arthur's final message to me. He told me exactly what Richard was planning to do the moment he was gone. He warned me that Richard would try to leave me with nothing. If you want to know what a guilty man looks like, you should have seen Richard's face in that exact moment. The color completely drained from his cheeks. He looked like he had just seen a ghost walk right through the doors of my courtroom. The arrogant posture, the expensive suit, the heavy gold watch, none of it could protect him now. Privilege had just collided with reality. I leaned back in my leather chair and looked down at the widow. "Bring it up here to the microphone," I commanded. "Play the audio." Eleanor walked up to the bailiff's desk. Her hands were no longer shaking. She handed the small black recorder to my bailiff, who placed it directly against the court's microphone. The entire gallery leaned forward. You could feel the collective breath of the room hitch. The tape clicked, hissed with a bit of static, and then a man's voice echoed through the courtroom. It was weak, raspy, the sound of failing lungs, but the conviction in it was absolute. "Elle," the voice wheezed, "if you are listening to this, I am gone, and I am so sorry, but you need to listen carefully. Richard is going to try to bleed the accounts dry. He has been doing it for months. He set up a shell LLC in Delaware called Apex Holdings. He has been funneling our operational budget there, calling them consulting fees. He thinks because I am dying, I am blind. I am not. Don't let him take the house, Elle. He will try to leave you with nothing. You fight him. You fight him for everything." The tape clicked off. The silence that followed was heavier than a concrete block. I looked at Richard. The smug, tailored, arrogant businessman from 5 minutes ago had completely evaporated. He was sweating profusely, tugging at the collar of his expensive shirt as if it were suddenly choking him. Privilege and power look incredibly fragile when the truth strips them bare. "Your Honor," he stammered, his voice cracking. That proves nothing. A dying man's paranoid delusions, influenced by heavy pain medication. It is hearsay. You cannot admit that into evidence." "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel. "Do you think I was born yesterday? Do you think I have sat on this bench for decades without learning how to spot a cornered rat? You stand in my courtroom, wearing a suit paid for by your dead brother's sweat, and you have the audacity to call him delusional?" I turned to my clerk. "Pull up the business registry for the state of Delaware. I want to see if an Apex Holdings exists, and I want to see exactly who the registered agent is." Richard gripped the edges of his podium. He knew it was over, but in a court of law, it is never just about catching the thief, it is about restoring the victim. I looked back at Eleanor. She stood tall, tears streaming down her face, not of sorrow, but of absolute vindication. The man she loved had protected her from the very edge of the grave. "Mr. Vance," I said, leaning forward, staring right through him, "if my clerk finds your name on that LLC, $10,000 is going to be the absolute least of your worries." The seconds ticked by as my clerk, moving with the quiet efficiency that I demand in my courtroom, typed away at his computer terminal. You could have cut the tension in the room with a dull butter knife. I did not take my eyes off Richard Vance. He was shifting his weight from his left foot to his right, pulling at the cuffs of his expensive suit jacket. His smugness had completely vanished, replaced by the cornered, desperate look of a man who suddenly realizes the walls are rapidly closing in. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to spin another desperate web of lies. But I raised a single finger. "Do not say a word," I warned him, my voice dangerously low. "Unless you are about to confess to perjury and fraud right here and now, keep your mouth shut until I address you." He snapped his jaw shut. "Good." A moment later, the printer beside my clerk's desk whirred to life. My clerk took the single sheet of paper, scanned it briefly with raised eyebrows, and handed it up to the bench. I put my reading glasses back on and took my time looking at the document. I love letting a liar stew in his own juices. It is one of the few true pleasures of this job. I read the lines of text carefully, letting the heavy silence stretch until it was almost unbearable for the man standing at the defendant's podium. Then, I slowly looked over the rim of my glasses, piercing Richard with a stare that has withered men twice his size. "Well, well, well," I said, dropping the piece of paper onto my mahogany desk with a sharp, echoing slap. "Apex Holdings Limited Liability Company, registered in the state of Delaware. And would you look at who the sole registered agent and managing director is? Richard Vance. The entity was formed exactly 3 weeks after your brother received his terminal diagnosis. Your Honor, I can explain," Richard stammered, his hands visibly shaking now as he gripped the podium. "That is a legitimate corporate subsidiary for tax purposes. It was completely legal, I assure you." "Baloney," I shouted, the word echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "Do not pee on my leg and tell me it is raining, Mr. Vance. Do not stand there and insult my intelligence. You didn't just steal from a dying man. You sat back, watched your own brother wither away, and systematically plotted to rob his grieving widow of her home, her security, and her sanity. You are not a businessman. You are a vulture." I turned my attention back to Eleanor. The frail, trembling woman who had walked into my courtroom 20 minutes ago was completely gone. In her place stood a woman anchored by the undeniable power of the truth. She held her head high, her eyes locked on the man who had tried to destroy her, watching his privilege utterly collapse under the weight of his own calculated greed. Richard stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled out of water. He looked frantically around my courtroom, perhaps hoping to find a sympathetic face in the gallery. He found none. People who watch a grieving widow get robbed do not offer sympathy to the thief. "Your Honor, please," he begged, the slick veneer of his tailored suit now totally irrelevant. "If I return the full $50,000 right now, we can consider this matter settled. It was a family misunderstanding resolved internally. There is absolutely no need to escalate this beyond civil court." I let out a laugh that had absolutely zero humor in it. "Mr. Vance, you do not get to dictate the terms of your own surrender. You do not get to commit grand larceny, get caught red-handed on an audio tape by your late brother, have your offshore shell company exposed by my clerk, and then politely offer to hit the undo button. That is not how the law works, and that is certainly not how my courtroom operates." I picked up the printout of the Delaware LLC registration and held it up in the air. "You thought this was a simple, easy, small claims case. You thought your sister-in-law was too weak, too grief-stricken, and too poor to fight back. You banked on her despair, but you made one fatal miscalculation. You underestimated her, you underestimated your dying brother, and you severely underestimated me." I turned to Eleanor, whose posture had transformed from a broken, trembling widow into a pillar of quiet strength. "Mrs. Vance, let me ask you a question. Did he offer you any help with the funeral expenses? Did he offer to help with the mortgage when he drained the joint operating account?" Eleanor shook her head, her voice steady and clear for the entire room to hear. "No, Your Honor. He told me Arthur left the business in massive debt. He told me I was lucky he wasn't suing me personally for the deficit. He stood right at my husband's graveside, hugged me while I cried, and told me he would take care of everything. And then he walked away and went straight to the bank." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Even my bailiff, who has seen the absolute worst of human nature over his long career, tightened his jaw and glared at the defendant. "You are a real piece of work, Mr. Vance," I said, dropping the paper back onto my heavy mahogany desk. "You stood over your own brother's grave and lied to his grieving widow, knowing full well you were actively robbing her blind. You used the sacred bond of family as a weapon." I looked down at the financial documents and the official citation in front of me. "You are currently being sued for $10,000, which is the absolute maximum this specific civil court can award, and I am going to grant her that today. But do not for 1 second think that writing a check gets you off the hook for the remaining $40,000 or the criminal fraud you have committed." "But, Your Honor," Richard pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine that echoed off the high ceiling of my courtroom. "I am family. If you pursue this, if you refer this to criminal court, it will destroy our family's reputation. Think of what Arthur would want. He wouldn't want his own brother behind bars." "Do not mention your brother's name in my courtroom," I roared. The sound cracked through the room like a whip, making Richard physically flinch backward. "You gave up the right to invoke your brother's memory the exact second you decided to use his death as a smokescreen to rob his wife. You want to talk about family reputation? You dragged your family's reputation through the mud the moment you set up a fraudulent offshore account to hide stolen money. That was your choice, not hers." I pointed my gavel directly at him, my patience absolutely exhausted. "People like you make me sick. You walk in here with your tailored suits and your expensive watches, thinking the rules of human decency do not apply to you. You think an apology after the fact wipes the slate clean. Let me educate you, sir. An apology is what you say when you accidentally step on someone's foot. When you systematically launder $50,000 from a grieving widow, you don't get to apologize. You get indicted." I turned to my clerk, who was already waiting for my instruction, his hands poised over the keyboard. "I want a full transcript of today's hearing, along with copies of the Delaware LLC registration and the audio recording provided by the plaintiff. Send it directly to the district attorney's office this afternoon with my personal recommendation for an immediate criminal investigation into felony fraud, grand larceny, and embezzlement." Richard collapsed heavily against his podium, burying his face in his manicured hands. The expensive gold watch on his wrist caught the harsh courtroom light, but it no longer looked like a symbol of untouchable wealth. It looked like a heavy set of handcuffs waiting to happen. The power dynamic in the room had completely and violently flipped. He was no longer the untouchable corporate businessman. He was just a common thief caught in a steel trap of his own arrogant making. I looked over at Eleanor. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She stood with her shoulders pulled back, her chin held high, watching the man who had tried to utterly ruin her face, the absolute, unforgiving wrath of the justice system. Richard tried to speak again, but the words died in his throat. He looked at my bailiff, who had already stepped out from behind his desk and was moving deliberately toward the defendant's podium. In a standard civil dispute, we do not usually detain people right then and there, but given the immediate, undeniable evidence of grand larceny, perjury, and the severe flight risk a wealthy man like Richard posed, I was not taking any chances. "Bailiff," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality, "escort Mr. Vance to the holding area. He will wait there while the district attorney reviews the preliminary evidence. I am holding him in contempt for lying under oath in my courtroom." "You can't do this," Richard yelled as the bailiff firmly grasped his arm. The expensive tailored suit wrinkled, and his perfectly styled hair fell out of place. He was flailing, a man drowning in his own consequences. "I have rights. I have a name in this town." "You have the right to remain silent, sir, and I highly suggest you start exercising it," I replied, not breaking eye contact until the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind him. The loud thud of those doors felt like the closing of a steel vault. The arrogance, the privilege, the sheer audacity of a man who thought his bank account made him invincible, all of it was gone, dragged out of my courtroom by the collar. I took a deep breath, letting the adrenaline settle, and turned my full attention back to the plaintiff's podium. Eleanor Vance was still standing there. The battered leather handbag was held loosely in her hands now. The heavy, suffocating weight of grief and betrayal that she had carried into this room had been lifted. She looked exhausted, yes, but she also looked entirely free. "Mrs. Vance," I said, my tone softening into something much gentler, "I am profoundly sorry for the loss of your husband. He sounded like a man who loved you very much, enough to make sure you were protected even when he was taking his last breaths. That audio recording was your shield, But your own courage is what brought you here today." She wiped her eyes, offering a small, trembling smile. "Thank you, Your Honor. I just wanted the truth out." "And you got it," I assured her. "You will get your $10,000 from this civil suit, and I promise you, the criminal court will ensure you get the rest of every single penny that belongs to you. Do not let anyone ever make you feel small or powerless again." Let me tell you something, my friends. This is exactly why the truth matters. People will try to blind you with their wealth, their fancy titles, and their polished excuses. They think power is an invisible shield that can deflect consequence. But power fails, privilege collapses, and when the dust finally settles, character is the only thing that remains standing. Arthur Vance had character. Eleanor Vance had character. And Richard? Richard had an expensive suit and a jail cell waiting for him. I looked around my quiet courtroom, gathered my case files, and picked up my wooden gavel. Judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $10,000. We are finished here. Court is adjourned.